The fluorescent light in Sarah Jenkins's kitchen had a nervous, insistent flicker, casting long shadows that danced across the cramped room. It was 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the world outside her small apartment was quiet, settled into the deep chill of a late autumn night. Inside, however, there was no peace. On her worn-out Formica table, a battlefield was laid out. On one side lay her paycheck from Gus's Grocery, a flimsy piece of paper whose numbers felt more like an insult than a reward for 45 hours of standing, scanning, and forced smiling. On the other side, the enemy. A small stack of receipts from the value farm down the street, their bold black ink screaming prices that felt like typos. And in the middle, penned on the back of a junk mail envelope, was her ledger. It wasn't a list of her own debts, but the debts of her neighbors, the ones the world had forgotten. Mrs. Gable, lisinopril, 42.5. Mr. Chen, metformin, 38. Javier, albuterol inhaler, 280. Sarah's fingers traced the last line, the most damning of them all. $280. A full week's pay for her, and an impossible sum for Maria, Javier's mother, who cleaned offices from dusk till dawn. Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath, the kind that never quite fills your lungs. She did the math for the 100th time, her pen scratching against the paper. After her rent, her student loan payment, a ghost from a life she thought she'd have, and her utilities, she had exactly 91.34 left. Enough for Mrs. Gable's blood pressure pills and Mr. Chen's diabetes medication. Not even close to enough for Javier's inhaler. A wave of cold dread washed over her, the familiar companion to this nightly ritual. The choice was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. Who gets to breathe easy this week? The sweet elderly woman who always saved her the day-old pastries from the bakery where she used to work, or the quiet, dignified man who had once fixed her screen door for free? Her phone buzzed, a harsh sound in the silence. It was Maria. The text was short, stripped of all pleasantries, leaving only the raw, sharp edge of panic. His breathing is bad. The inhaler is 280 this month. I don't get paid until Friday. Anything helps. Anything helps. The three most devastating words in the English language. They were a confession of utter defeat, a final, whispered plea into the void. Sarah closed her eyes, and for a moment she wasn't in her kitchen. She was 14 again, watching her own mother slice tiny blue pills in half with a kitchen knife, her hands trembling. "Just to make them stretch, sweetie?" she'd said, her smile never quite reaching her tired eyes. The doctor said it's okay. The doctor had been wrong. Sarah's eyes snapped open. The decision was made. Mrs. Gable and Mr. Chen would have to wait. They were stable. Javier wasn't. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping against the linoleum. Her own grocery money would have to go. It would be a week of instant noodles and tap water, but the image of that little boy gasping for air was a far more terrifying hunger. An hour later, bundled in a dark coat with the collar pulled high, Sarah moved like a phantom through the sleeping neighborhood. The value farm bag, crinkling softly, was tucked into her pocket. It felt both like a sacrament and a piece of contraband. She approached Mrs. Gable's small duplex first, her sneakers silent on the cracked pavement. A porch light from across the street cast a pale, accusatory glow. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Every passing car was a potential witness, every curtain twitch, a potential accusation. She quickly and quietly placed a small, unmarked envelope containing $43 in cash in Mrs. Gable's mailbox, along with a note. "For your lisinopril, don't worry about it." It wasn't the medicine, but it was the next best thing. She did the same for Mr. Chen. Then, she made her way to Javier's apartment complex on the other side of the neighborhood. She didn't drop this one on the doorstep. She waited, huddled in the shadows, until Maria's exhausted figure appeared, walking home from the bus stop. Sarah stepped out, and Maria's shoulders, which had been slumped in defeat, straightened with a jolt of hope. "Sarah," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. Sarah simply pushed the small paper bag into her hands. "For Javier," she whispered. Maria clutched the bag to her chest like a holy relic. She didn't have the words. She just reached out and squeezed Sarah's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. In the dim light, Sarah could see the tears tracking paths through the weariness on her friend's face. It was a thank you more profound than any sentence. As Sarah walked home, the gnawing hunger in her stomach was eclipsed by a fierce, burning sense of purpose. This was right. It had to be. The mission hadn't started as a mission at all. It had started with a ghost. The ghost of her mother, Eleanor Jenkins, a woman who had measured her life in copays and deductibles. Sarah's memories of her mother's last year were not of laughter or warm hugs, but of the clinking sound of pills in a plastic weekly organizer, a sound that became quieter and quieter as the pills were stretched, split, and skipped. The sharpest memory, the one that ambushed her in the quiet moments, was of a Saturday afternoon. Her mother was at the same kitchen table, the one Sarah now used for her own dark accounting. Eleanor was holding a single pill in her palm, a tiny blue speck that cost $12. She was supposed to take one every day. "I think if I take one every other day, I'll be fine," Eleanor had said, her voice a little too bright. "It'll make the prescription last twice as long. We can put that money toward the electric bill." Sarah, then only 15, had simply nodded, trusting her mother's judgment, not understanding the brutal calculus she was being forced to perform. The choice between the electricity that kept the lights on and the medicine that kept her heart beating. 2 weeks later, the 911 call. The paramedics, their faces grim and professional. The sterile, indifferent beep of a flatlining heart monitor in the emergency room. The doctor, a man with tired eyes and a kind face, had told them it was a massive coronary event. He'd asked if she had been taking her medication as prescribed. Sarah's father, a man broken by grief, couldn't answer. But Sarah knew. The guilt had settled into her bones, a cold, heavy thing that never left. It was a promise carved into the deepest part of her. Never again. Never again would she stand by, while someone had to choose between living and paying a bill. Her father passed away a few years later, worn down by a broken heart and the mountain of medical debt her mother had left behind. Sarah was left alone with the memories and the promise. The promise first took shape with Mr. Chen. He was a regular at Gus's grocery, a quiet widower who always bought the same things: a small container of rice, some bok choy, and a single chicken thigh. One afternoon, Sarah was behind him in line at the value farm. She watched as the pharmacist, a young woman with a practiced, sympathetic smile, told him the total for his metformin. "Mr." Chen's shoulders slumped. He looked at the cash in his wrinkled hand, then back at the pharmacist. "I will have to wait," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I will come back in a few more days." He turned to leave, his face a mask of quiet shame. Something inside Sarah snapped. She saw her mother in his downcast eyes. Before she could think, she stepped forward. "I'll get it," she said, her voice louder than she intended. Mr. Chen turned, startled. "No, no, young lady, I cannot." "Please," Sarah insisted, her hand already on her wallet. "Let me." She paid the $38, a significant dent in her own weekly budget. The pharmacist gave her a strange look, a mixture of pity and suspicion. Sarah didn't care. She walked outside with Mr. Chen, who stood blinking in the afternoon sun, clutching the bag of medication. He tried to offer her the few dollars he had. She gently pushed his hand away. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and his eyes, which had been clouded with worry, were suddenly clear and shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said, and the simple words held the weight of a lifetime of struggle. "You are a very kind girl." That was the spark. Mr. Chen, in his quiet dignity, had shown her the way. Soon, she was paying attention everywhere. She heard the whispered conversations at the grocery store checkout, saw the worried faces in the pharmacy line. She started small, leaving $20 in an envelope for Mrs. Gable, a retired baker who lived on a pittance of Social Security. Then she heard about Maria and Javier from another coworker. The list grew. Her life shrank, distilled down to her shifts at Gus's and her secret deliveries in the dark. It was a lonely, exhausting existence, but every time she saw the relief on someone's face, she felt her mother's ghost rest a little easier. She was keeping her promise. For nearly a year, Sarah operated in the shadows, a ghost of kindness haunting the edges of her neighborhood. But ghosts cannot remain unseen forever. The first person to notice her was not a grateful neighbor, but a man for whom compassion was a liability. Mr. Arthur Finch, the district manager of the value farm. Finch was a man built of sharp angles and starched collars. He didn't live in the neighborhood. He descended upon it once a month in his silver sedan to review profit margins and enforce corporate policy. He saw customers not as people, but as data points on a sales chart, and Sarah Jenkins was an anomaly. He cornered her one rainy afternoon by the cough and cold aisle. She had just paid for 3 different prescriptions for 3 different people, a transaction that had drained her bank account to single digits. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice smooth and cold as polished granite. His name tag read, A. Finch, District Manager, in stark, unforgiving letters. A moment of your time. Sarah's stomach tightened. Can I help you? That's what I'd like to ascertain, he said, giving her a thin, reptilian smile. We've noticed a pattern with your purchases. You seem to be filling a rather diverse and significant quantity of prescriptions for various individuals. Our records show purchases for cardiac, diabetic, and respiratory medications, all in the last month. For someone your age, it's a statistical improbability. He wasn't asking, he was accusing. His eyes were small and dark, devoid of any warmth. They're 4 friends, Sarah stammered, her mind racing for a plausible lie. People who can't get out. Finch's smile didn't waver. Of course. However, company policy, and indeed federal law, is quite strict regarding the third-party handling and distribution of prescription medication. It creates a chain of custody issue, a liability. We have a responsibility to mitigate risk and ensure compliance with all pharmaceutical protocols. The corporate jargon was a shield, a way to dehumanize the situation. He wasn't talking about helping people, he was talking about risk mitigation. I'm just trying to help, she whispered, the words sounding feeble even to her own ears. Your intentions, while perhaps noble in your own mind, are irrelevant, Finch said, his tone sharpening. What is relevant is that Value Farm will not be exposed to litigation because of your freelance charity work. Consider this a friendly official warning. This pattern cannot continue. He adjusted his tie, a final dismissive gesture, and walked away, leaving Sarah standing amidst the brightly colored boxes of cold medicine, feeling chilled to the bone. The second pair of eyes belonged to Brenda, who lived 3 houses down. Brenda was a woman whose sense of self-worth was directly proportional to the perceived orderliness of her surroundings. She was the self-appointed guardian of Elm Street's property values and moral character, and a prominent member of the Homeowners Association. From the pristine vantage point of her living room window, she saw the world not as a community of people, but as a collection of potential infractions. Sarah's house was becoming an infraction. Brenda noticed the late-night visitors, the quick, hushed exchanges on the porch. She saw Maria's tearful thank you and misinterpreted it as something illicit. She saw Mr. Chen leaving a small bag of homegrown bok choy on Sarah's doorstep and saw it as a strange, suspicious payment. Her campaign began subtly on the Elm Street Neighbors Facebook page. Brenda Miller posted, "Has anyone else noticed an increase in unusual late-night foot traffic on our street? We need to remain vigilant to maintain the safety and character of our wonderful neighborhood. Community watch, safe streets." The post was followed by a string of comments from other worried residents. Then, the direct approach began. Brenda started, coincidentally, watering her petunias whenever Sarah left the house, her eyes following Sarah's every move. One evening, as Sarah was getting into her car, Brenda called out from across the lawn, her voice dripping with saccharine venom. "Everything all right over there, Sarah? You've been having so much company lately." The intimidation tactics escalated. Finch, true to his word, instituted a new policy. Sarah was now required to show her ID for every single transaction, even for a bottle of aspirin. Refills for the people she helped were suddenly delayed, lost in the system, requiring frantic phone calls to doctors' offices that only added to Sarah's stress. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts, designed to wear her down. Brenda's methods were less sophisticated. A week after Finch's warning, Sarah found a folded piece of paper tucked under her windshield wiper. The words were cut from magazines and pasted onto the page, like a ransom note in an old movie. "We know what you are doing. This is a decent neighborhood." Sarah's hands trembled as she read it. She looked toward Brenda's house. The living room curtains twitched. For the first time, she felt a genuine spike of fear. She wasn't just fighting a system of heartless costs and corporate policies anymore. She was fighting the petty, vicious tyranny of a neighbor who had mistaken kindness for crime. The walls, once distant and abstract, were now closing in, solid and suffocating. The breaking point arrived, as it so often does, with the sound of a child struggling to breathe. It came through the phone on a frigid Thursday night, just as Sarah was counting the tips from her shift. It was Maria, her voice a raw, ragged thread of panic. "Sarah, it's Javier," she cried, the words tumbling over each other. He can't, oh God, he can't breathe." In the background, Sarah could hear it, a high-pitched, desperate wheezing that sounded like a tiny, broken whistle. It was the sound of a life being squeezed out. The inhaler, the one we have, is empty. I tried to get the refill today, but they said there was a problem. They said the doctor didn't approve it. Sarah's blood ran cold. Finch. This was Finch's doing. He had lost the refill request. A petty act of bureaucratic warfare with a 10-year-old boy as collateral damage. I'm on my way, Sarah said, her voice a low, steady promise that belied the frantic thumping of her own heart. Call 911 right now, Maria. I'll meet you at the hospital, but I'm going to the pharmacy first. She didn't bother with her coat. She grabbed her keys and her debit card and sprinted out the door, the icy air searing her lungs. The drive to the Value Farm took 4 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Every red light a personal torment. She burst through the automatic doors, her chest heaving, and ran to the pharmacy counter at the back of the store. Mr. Finch was there, overseeing the night shift pharmacist. He looked up, and a flicker of cruel satisfaction crossed his face when he saw her. Javier Castillo, Sarah gasped, leaning against the counter. He needs his albuterol refill. His mother called, he's having a severe attack. Finch took his time, slowly tapping at his keyboard. Castillo, he murmured, feigning a search. Ah, yes. I'm afraid there's an issue with the authorization from Dr. Miller's office. We can't dispense it without proper approval. You know that's not true, Sarah's voice rose, cracking with desperation. His prescription is on file. You did this deliberately. You flagged his account. Miss Jenkins, Finch said, his voice dropping to a condescending purr. I will not be accused of malpractice by someone with a hobby of illegally distributing controlled substances. The policy is the policy. Perhaps if Javier's mother had managed his medication more responsibly, she wouldn't be in this position. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The injustice of it, the sheer, unadulterated cruelty ignited a fire in her chest. All the fear, all the exhaustion, all the quiet desperation of the past year boiled over into pure, incandescent rage. You sanctimonious monster, she snarled, her voice echoing through the quiet store. This is a child's life you're playing with. Fill the prescription. Now. She slammed her hand on the counter, rattling a display of hand sanitizer. That's it, Finch said, a triumphant smirk on his lips. He picked up the phone behind the counter. I'm calling the police. You are trespassing and creating a disturbance. By the time the police cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing silently in the parking lot, Brenda was already there. She'd seen Sarah's car peel out of her driveway and had followed, her own car a dark shadow trailing behind. She stood by the entrance, arms crossed, a righteous glint in her eye, ready to give her witness statement. The officer who came in was a man named Miller. He was older, with a weary face that suggested he'd seen every kind of human folly. He listened patiently, first to Finch's calm, professional account of Sarah's hysterical and threatening behavior, then to Brenda's breathless narrative about suspicious activity and drug deals. Finally, he turned to Sarah. She tried to explain, the words catching in her throat as she described Javier's wheezing, her mother's memory, the impossible cost of medicine. She could see a flicker of sympathy in his eyes, a weariness that matched her own, but it was buried under the heavy armor of his uniform and his duty. Ma'am, I understand you're trying to do a good thing, he said, his voice gentle but firm. I really do, but Mr. Finch is technically within his rights. We can't force him to dispense a medication if the paperwork isn't in order, and what you're doing, buying prescriptions for other people, it's against the law. I can't let you play doctor. My hands are tied. He escorted her outside, away from the sterile lights of the pharmacy and the venomous glare of her neighbor. He didn't write a ticket, but he gave her an official warning for trespassing. Don't come back here tonight, he advised. Go to the hospital. Let the doctors handle it. Sarah stood on the cold pavement, watching the cruiser pull away. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She had failed. The system, in all its cold, bureaucratic, and judgmental glory, had won. Humiliation and despair washed over her in a suffocating wave. She leaned against her car, the fight completely gone from her, and for the first time in a very long time, she began to cry. Excuse me, Miss Jenkins? The voice was hesitant, quiet. Sarah looked up, wiping her eyes. A young man stood a few feet away, holding a Value Farm bag of his own. He had kind eyes and a reporter's notebook in his hand. My name is David Chen, he said. I'm with the local Herald. I was in there, waiting for my son's prescription. I saw everything. He paused, his gaze full of an empathy she hadn't seen all night. Can I please hear your story? Sarah hesitated for only a moment. The fight had been drained out of her, but in its place was a hollow emptiness that David Chen's quiet question began to fill. She looked at his earnest face, at the notebook held like an offering, and something inside her gave way. She talked. She told him everything. She told him about her mother and the pills cut in half, about Mr. Chen and his quiet shame, about Maria's frantic text and Javier's struggle for breath. She told him about Finch's veiled threats and Brenda's poison pen notes. The story poured out of her, a torrent of grief and frustration held back for too long. David Chen didn't interrupt. He just listened, his pen flying across the page. 2 days later, the story broke. It wasn't on the front page of the print edition. It was published on the local Herald's website, where stories could travel at the speed of light. David had titled it, "The Corner Store Angel versus the 300 Inhaler: How One Woman's Kindness Became a Crime on Elm Street." It was a masterpiece of human interest journalism. He framed Sarah's story not as a crime, but as a symptom of a deeply broken system. He included her heartbreaking account of her mother, the quiet dignity of the people she helped, and the impossible choices they faced. He also included quotes from his interview with Mr. Finch, who, in his attempt to sound professional, came across as a callous, soulless bureaucrat. Value Farm adheres to the strictest protocols to ensure patient safety and corporate compliance, Finch was quoted as saying. We cannot make exceptions for individuals who fail to manage their own healthcare needs responsibly. David even included a screenshot of one of Brenda's anonymous posts from the neighborhood Facebook group. The article was a perfectly constructed narrative of a humble hero being crushed by corporate greed and petty, small-minded cruelty. The story didn't just get views, it detonated. It was shared on Twitter, on Facebook, on Reddit. It was picked up by national news aggregators. By noon, Corner Store Angel was trending. David Chen had set up a simple GoFundMe page with a modest goal of $50 to help Sarah with legal fees. Within 3 hours, it had surpassed $50. By evening, it had crashed from the sheer volume of traffic. The comments section was a tidal wave of fury and support. People shared their own horror stories of battling insurance companies and pharmacies. They eviscerated Finch and Brenda, their digital rage a palpable force. But for every angry comment, there were 10 of love and support for Sarah. They called her a hero, a saint, an angel. For the first time, Sarah realized she wasn't alone. An entire army of strangers had her back. Then, 4 days after the article was published, the envelope arrived. It was plain, white, standard business size, with no return address. The postmark was from Chicago. It felt heavier than a normal letter. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she performed her nightly triage, and slid it open with a trembling hand. Inside was no letter, no card, just a single folded piece of paper, a cashier's check from a major national bank. The amount was for $100. Beneath it, tucked into the fold, was a small, typewritten note. It was simple, direct, and powerful. Don't stop. Do it right. Give them hell. Sarah stared at the check, at the impossible string of zeros. It didn't feel real. It was more money than she had ever seen, a sum that could change her life forever. But her first thought wasn't of herself. It was of Mrs. Gable, of Mr. Chen, of Javier. This wasn't just money. It was freedom. It was ammunition. It was power. That afternoon, she walked back into the Value Farm. Her steps were not frantic or desperate this time, but measured and deliberate. She wore a simple, clean blouse and jeans, but she walked as if she were wearing a suit of armor. Mr. Finch was at the counter, berating a young pharmacist. He saw Sarah and his face hardened into a mask of contempt. He immediately reached for the phone. I warned you about trespassing, he hissed. Sarah didn't say a word. She reached into her purse, pulled out the cashier's check, and laid it flat on the counter with a soft, definitive thud. The sound seemed to suck all the air out of the pharmacy. Finch stared at it, his mouth opened slightly. The color drained from his face as he read the numbers. I am prepaying the accounts for Eleanor Gable, Wei Chen, and Javier Castillo for the next 10 years, Sarah said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the sterile silence of the store. It did not shake. I am also creating a community fund. My lawyer and yes, I have a lawyer now will be in touch to set up direct billing for 50 other families in this neighborhood. You will fill every single prescription, on time, without issue. You will treat them with respect, and you will never ever question their responsibility again. Finch looked from the check to Sarah's face. He saw no fear, no desperation. he saw only a calm, unyielding resolve. The power dynamic had been irrevocably shattered. He, the man of rules and policies, was utterly defeated by a piece of paper and the quiet woman who had placed it there. The smugness, the condescension, the cruelty had all melted away, leaving behind the small, pathetic man he truly was. For the readers of Sarah's story, for everyone who had raged on her behalf, this was the moment of ultimate, glorious catharsis. The check was not an ending, it was a beginning. It was the foundation stone for an ark, a vessel to carry her community through the flood of indifference and greed. In the weeks that followed, the world around Sarah reconfigured itself, bending toward the gravity of her newfound purpose and power. The first domino to fall was Mr. Finch. The viral article, coupled with a deluge of formal complaints to the Value Farm corporate office, many from former customers who now saw their own frustrating experiences with Finch in a new light, triggered an internal investigation. Finch, the consummate company man, was now a liability. A week after his humiliating encounter with Sarah and the check, he was quietly transferred. Sarah heard from one of the younger, friendlier pharmacists that he'd been reassigned to a low-volume store in a remote part of North Dakota, a corporate exile from which he was unlikely to return. The second domino was Brenda. Her crusade against Sarah had made her a pariah in her own kingdom. The Elm Street Neighbors Facebook page, once her personal fiefdom, was now filled with posts praising Sarah. Neighbors who had once nodded politely now crossed the street to avoid her. At the next HOA meeting, a motion was brought forward to have her removed from the board for conduct unbecoming of a community representative. It passed with a nearly unanimous vote. Brenda was left to stew in her pristine house, a queen with no subjects, her view of the neighborhood now one of people who had judged her and found her wanting. But as the antagonists faded, the allies emerged. A prestigious downtown law firm, whose senior partner had been deeply moved by David Chen's article, reached out and offered to handle all of Sarah's legal needs pro bono. They expertly navigated the labyrinthine process of establishing a legitimate 501(3) nonprofit, the Sarah Jenkins Community Health Fund. The name felt impossibly grand to her, but the lawyers insisted. Her name was now a brand, they explained, a symbol of hope. One evening, there was a knock on her door. It was Officer Miller, holding his hat in his hands, his uniform looking stiff and out of place in the warm light of her doorway. He wasn't there on official business. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his weary eyes filled with a sincere regret. "I just wanted to apologize. For that night, I was doing my job, but sometimes the job makes you part of the problem. What you're doing is a fine thing." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a check of his own. It was for $100. "This is from me and my wife, for the fund." The biggest breakthrough came from an unexpected place. The owner of The Pillbox, a small independent pharmacy on the other side of town that had been struggling to compete with chains like Value Farm, called her directly. He offered to partner with her fund, providing all the medications at his wholesale cost, a move that would nearly double the impact of every dollar she spent. With the legal and logistical structures falling into place, Sarah could finally focus on the people. She saw the changes her arc was making firsthand. She was there when Mrs. Gable picked up a 3-month supply of her heart medication, tears of relief streaming down her face. "I can finally sleep through the night without worrying," she told Sarah. She was there to deliver a brand new, top-of-the-line nebulizer to Javier, who looked at the machine with wide, wondrous eyes, as if it were the most exciting toy in the world. The cloud of fear that had hung over these families was beginning to lift, replaced by the clear, bright sky of security. Sarah's life was no longer about secret drops and hushed exchanges in the dark. It was about board meetings and partnership agreements, about hope and legitimate, sustainable change. 6 months later, Sarah stood not in her cramped kitchen, but in a small, clean office space in a modest storefront downtown. The peeling paint had been covered with a fresh coat of warm, welcoming blue. The flickering fluorescent bulb had been replaced by gentle, modern lighting. This was the official headquarters of the Sarah Jenkins Community Health Fund. It wasn't fancy. The furniture was secondhand, the computers were donated, and the coffee was brewed in a simple pot in the corner. But it was real. It was hers. On the wall behind her desk, where a calendar or a corporate memo might hang, she had pinned dozens of handwritten thank you notes from the families she now supported. There were crayon drawings from children and carefully penned letters from seniors. It was a mural of gratitude. She was no longer a cashier. The fund, buoyed by the initial $100,000 donation and the continued success of the GoFundMe, was now able to pay her a modest salary, enough to live on without the constant, gnawing anxiety she had known her whole life. She had hired Maria, Javier's mother, as her part-time administrative assistant. Watching her work at the desk opposite, her face relaxed and focused, was one of Sarah's greatest joys. The phone on her desk rang, a cheerful, professional chime. She picked it up. Community Health Fund, this is Sarah speaking. The voice on the other end was young, trembling, and tight with a panic Sarah recognized instantly. It was the sound of a person at the end of their rope. "Hi, my name is Amy," the woman stammered. "My daughter? She's diabetic. We just moved here, our insurance hasn't kicked in yet, and I can't afford her insulin this month. I don't know what to do. Someone at the clinic told me to try calling you." Sarah looked around her office, at the smiling face of her friend, at the wall of thank you notes, at the sturdy checkbook sitting on her desk. The ghost of her mother was no longer a weight on her shoulders, but a gentle presence at her side, smiling. The promise she had made in grief had blossomed into something she could never have imagined. She was no longer a secret Samaritan, operating in the shadows. She was a lighthouse. She leaned into the phone, her voice calm, confident, and full of a warmth that could banish the deepest chill. "Of course," Sarah said. "You called the right place. Tell me what you need. We're here to help."